wasn't terribly motivated. But again, I'm in school. You don't quit school. That background from my parents was you go and you get a degree, and because you need a degree, and so you're going to stay in school and you're going to do a good job. But of course, I'm paying for it. They're not, and so they're also not keeping up with me and supervising me. Looking at my grades, and so I took Spanish one year because my girlfriend was taking Spanish, and I got a D in the class because I wasn't interested in actually taking Spanish at the time. I was just interested because I was dating this girl who was going to take Spanish. And so for a period of time when I first got started, I was terribly unmotivated. I was a really, really bad student. So I've actually been at both ends of the spectrum where I'm getting lousy grades and not going to class and sleeping in class. I once slept through a final, or half of the final. So it was 2 hours. I slept through the first hour of it, and then my buddy woke me up, and I took the final, and I still did better than he did. But that was so my first that was essentially my first 5 years. So I took 5 years to get my first degree. I actually have 3 bachelor's degrees. I have a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration that I got from North Dakota State University. And when I was my last year, I started looking at what am I going to do with this degree now when I get out. And there didn't seem to be very good job prospects at the time. Recruiters were saying there's 200 to 300 job applicants for every business management position you could get out there, so you need to have something that makes you stand out. I also hadn't bothered to look into any internships, which I should have, so man, I was just doing all the wrong stuff, basically. I wasn't making myself marketable, I wasn't making myself stand out, and part of it was I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was just getting a degree to get a degree because that's what I was supposed to do. And so I finally started to look my last year, my senior year, and say, what should I actually do if I don't want to stay in business? And I actually went to the Career Counseling Center for the first time and started looking at information and found occupational therapy. I don't know if you know what an occupational therapist is, but occupational therapy is grounded in psychology. It actually started back in World War I, where combat soldiers would be experiencing shell shock and post-traumatic stress disorder. And at the time, that was all new. They really didn't understand any of that. And so occupational therapists were originally nurses who were working with these combat veterans and trying to figure out how to deal with that shock that they were experiencing. And so it was very much a psychology-based, but it was a lot of activities. What kinds of activities can we get them doing to get them back integrated into society and deal with those experiences that they had during the war. And over time, it progressed into a much broader field where it's both psychology, but there's also physical. You think of physical therapy. So you have physical therapy and occupational therapy. Physical therapists work with the body, but typically they're working with the lower extremities, walking, gait. Occupational therapists work with the upper extremities, so shoulders, arms, hand movements tend to be more in the realm of occupational therapy. And so it was a very broad field. You could work with children who have cerebral palsy, for example, and you can teach them how to do basic things for themselves, to eat, feed themselves, to change their clothes. Those kinds of things are part of occupational therapy. So occupational therapy basically became anything that a person does as an occupation. If you are a student, or as a child, or as a mother or father, or as an employee, those are all occupations. And so if you are unable to carry out those occupations, then an occupational therapist would figure out how to help you do that, either through adaptive technologies or retraining you, or just techniques and tools that would help you get there. And so I'm thinking this is a nice broad field because I can work with kids, I can work with adults in business, I could work with seniors, lots of opportunities. Looks like an interesting field. And so I looked at schools that offered occupational therapy, and I also wanted to get out in North Dakota because it's really cold up there. Average winter temperatures are down around 0 and often negative for weeks at a time, and that was just getting old. I ended up going to Eastern Kentucky University. It just worked out that school accepted me. And so I go to Eastern Kentucky University and I start in the OT program. This time I'm actually motivated. So my second round as an undergraduate, I'm going to actually put effort into this. Plus, OT at the time was super competitive. So in order to get into the program, I'm going to EKU, and I wasn't accepted going in. I got accepted to the school, but to get into the OT program, basically required a 4.0. They would have 300 students every semester applying for 50 positions. So it was super, super competitive, and you had to have a very high GPA. And at the time, that was primarily the cutoff was the GPA. And so if you didn't have a 4.0, you weren't getting in. And so, of course, I'm going to EKU with a 2.78 or something like that from North Dakota State University, not the best GPA. And so I pretty much had to start over. And so another thing is, the choices you make now when you're taking classes and you're kind of blowing those classes off, or you don't think an A is important, there's a cost associated with that. In this case, I had to take 2 years of classes to make up for that because they only counted, luckily they only counted your last 45 credits towards the GPA that counted towards getting into the program. And so I took my first 2 years and just got straight A's, and I did really well, taking things like anatomy and physiology and tough classes, but was able to do them because I was actually motivated and interested in it. So another thing is, identifying what you're really interested in. If you're taking IS classes and you're finding you're not as interesting as you thought, then maybe it's the wrong field for you, really. You want to be in a field where you're actually interested in the coursework because it really does map to the kind, whether you're going to have an interest in that field later on. Not every single course, right? There may be a few courses where you're not engaged completely and it's not as interesting. But if you don't like any of your courses in the field and you're not, that's maybe a good indicator that it's not a good major for you. But in this case, I was liking the classes. I get into my major, and it turns out that OT is tightly coupled with psychology, and so I double majored. And so I ended up taking 5 years to complete that program and double majored in occupational therapy and psychology. So now I have 3 undergraduate degrees. And I get done thinking that I'm going to have this great job as an OT. Well, it turned out that there were changes in Medicare legislation the year I graduated. So I'm about to graduate, and Medicare, the government decides that we're going to change how Medicare reimburses for therapy services. And before that, the law was under Medicare that if a doctor prescribed OT or PT or speech therapy, that whatever the doctor prescribed, Medicare would pay for. So as many hours as that was. And so you had nursing homes, for example, that would employ 4 and 5 occupational therapists because all of these elderly people really need occupational therapy. They can't take care of themselves. We should retrain them or try and help them be as independent as possible. And so 4 or 5 OTs provide therapy for all of these patients. Medicare changes and says the limit now is $1,500 annually. And these therapists are charging $200-300 an hour. And so how many hours is that? 5, 6, 7 hours in an entire year for a person, where before they were doing 2 to 3 hours a week sometimes. So now all of a sudden, all these nursing homes are laying off therapists left and right, and this awesome job market turned into nothing. When I graduated with my 50 cohort, I sat for my national certification exam 3 months after graduation, and only 6 out of the 50 had jobs at that point. So it's a really crappy market. So another thing is to understand what kind of a market you're getting into, what kind of job prospects there are. In IS, unless somebody figures out how to drop an EMP and totally wipe out IT altogether, job prospects are going to be pretty good. We are more and more dependent on technology, and so the potential for jobs in this field, at least in the near future, is good. And it looked that way, of course, for OT, and that was a function of legislation. And so then I had to find something else to do. I couldn't get a job at the time, and frankly, I kind of got a little demotivated later in the program, and so I ended up just going to work for some temp positions. I worked for Fidelity Investments as a brokerage rep for a while, and I worked in a couple other temp positions. And then my father-in-law came to me. My father-in-law worked in healthcare as a vendor. He specifically worked for a company called Executone that provided information and communication systems to hospitals and nursing homes and doctors' offices. Nurse call systems, paging systems, in-house wireless phone systems, infrared, RFID tracking, asset tracking systems. All of those things were part of what their company offered to healthcare organizations. And they needed somebody they had a couple of technicians who were quitting, and so they wanted a technician. And so I went in and started working on these systems and learned how to install them, learned how to service them, provided training on them. My first job was actually as a trainer to train the nurses on how to use these systems. Eventually I moved into sales and worked in sales for a while, but kind of ran the gambit in that organization, working in hospitals. I basically covered the state of Kentucky, southern Ohio, and southern Indiana, and so I traveled a lot. And I did that for 6 years. But after about the third year, about the third year, I realized that I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life, and I was actually missing academics. So I really liked the academic environment. I'd spent 10 years as an undergraduate and enjoyed most of it, even when I wasn't doing my best classes. And so I thought I need to do something different. And so I decided I'm going to go back and get some more education, and so I decided to go get a master's degree. And I looked at a variety of options and decided that I liked computers, I liked technology, and so I went for a master's degree in applied computing at Eastern Kentucky University. And I ended up going through that program at like 2 years. At the end of that 2 years, they have a comprehensive exam. And I took this comprehensive exam, and somehow I managed to fail it. And so they told me, okay, you have one more chance to take it, and if you fail it again, then you're out of the program. Okay, no problem. So I studied, and I studied, I went and took it again, and I failed it the second time. And apparently I was the first person ever to do this. So, interesting life experience. I was pretty pissed. I was mad. I was thinking, man, I just spent 2 years and a whole bunch of money paying for this program, and now they're not going to give me a degree. And fairly upset, and then all of a sudden I thought, you know what, that's life, I just need to move on. And so I decided, what can I do? And I found out that, well, I can go get an MBA, and most of my courses would carry over to that, and I would just need one more year. And I'd actually applied to PhD programs also, because one of my faculty members had talked me into going to get a PhD. He says, you like the academic environment, you seem to be pretty good at it. This is before I failed the exam. He said, you should get your PhD. So I actually applied to PhD programs, and I got accepted to 2 programs at the University of Kentucky and at the University of North Carolina. And I failed this exam, and I have to call up both schools and tell them, I'm not going to get my master's degree. Is that a problem? Both of them said, absolutely. You can't come to our program without a master's degree in hand. So we're sorry, but we're going to have to retract our offers. So again, I'm kind of upset about that. And I ended up switching. I go into the MBA program, and I reapplied the next year, but instead of applying to those programs, I applied to Georgia State University. And I hadn't done that the year before because I had missed their application deadline. But they're actually one of the best IS programs, PhD granting programs in the country. And they ended up accepting me. I finished my MBA. I graduated my graduation was July 26th. And I had to be in Atlanta a few days later. So basically, I packed up a U-Haul, packed up our van, our U-Haul, and all of our stuff from our house. Drove the U-Haul to graduation, walked through graduation, and kept on going.
Forget dinner.
Yeah. And spent 5 years there, and ended up getting my PhD from Georgia State University in computer information systems. And my dissertation and my research was healthcare focused because that was my background. I spent 6 years working as a vendor, and I had experience as a clinician working as an OT. So I never got paid to work as an OT, but I had done internships where I actually worked in a hospital, providing care for patients, doing therapy at the bedside, documenting care in patient records. And so I had that experience, and then I had it from the vendor side about how do we actually provide these kinds of systems and collect information and make that information available to those clinicians. And so for me, it was a natural fit to do that. And so my dissertation was in a hospital looking at Epic. Epic is an electronic medical record system. Renown uses Epic. There are others that are out there, but that is one of the bigger than Epic.
Do you know orthopedic?
Yes, correct. Yeah. And so Epic is a fairly popular one, EMR right now. And I ended up finding a hospital back where I came from. So I was in Atlanta, but I went back to Cincinnati where I had been working and got into a hospital there that had Epic. And basically studied how the nurses' work practices on patient care units were being impacted by the change with that EMR, going from a paper-based system to an electronic system, how that changed the way they cared for patients and interacted with patients, how that changed the way they interacted with each other, and how that changed the way they interacted with other clinicians and physicians. Because my background is also in psychology, I was interested in behavior more than, I'm more managerial, behavioral oriented than I am technical oriented, so I have some technical skills, but ECHODAL's the very technical end of what we have in our department. I'm at the more managerial end of it. I know some things.